Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for everyone who's joining us. Thank you to SupChina for helping organize such an amazing day. I am thrilled to have a panel of good friends and real experts on the US-China relationship, looking at it through the lens of cyber. So I'm Sam Sachs. I split my time between New America, where I'm a cyber policy fellow, and Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, joined by Carly Ramsey late at night in Shanghai, who leads up the cyber portfolio with control risks. Xiaomeng Liu, Access Partnerships, where she's a senior manager for Asia policy. Naomi Wilson in Washington, D.C., senior policy manager for Asia at Information Technology Industry Council. And my partner in crime, Graham Webster, who is at Stanford, where he is the editor-in-chief of the Digi China Project. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So the last time we were all together in person was oddly on January 15th in Seattle, where it later turned out, I think, one of the first official cases of COVID turned up. So little would we know that we would be brought together again in this strange new world. And Xiaomeng had kicked off our panel by asking whether technology was going to be the baby that saved or doomed the struggling marriage. Which was just a fabulous way to kind of open the discussion. And I wanted to sort of get caught up on where things stand since that time. It seems like a lot has changed. But also when it comes to the cyber relationship, a lot of things actually look very similar, right? So in Washington, for the past 1 to 2 years, we've really had this acceleration of scrutiny on a range of business activities involving China, where national security, and I'd say more specifically cybersecurity, has been a justification for looking to separate and sort of put more of a sort of wedge between whether you're talking about investment, export controls, scrutiny on specific Chinese companies in the supply chain, and in many ways mirroring what's been underway in Beijing for years, primarily focused on the cybersecurity law, and we'll talk about this in a moment, and its associated policy regulations and standards, which is part of a broader effort to really reduce reliance on foreign vendors in core technologies, while at the same time giving the Chinese government more tools to monitor and control cyberspace. So I want to start with the view from China on this, and particularly when it comes to the cybersecurity law. Carly, can you kick us off? And we've talked about sort of your take on a lot of these rules and regulations has been a bit of there's nothing to see here, but it's gotten so much attention, I think, from media outside of China, particularly when it comes to separation in the trade and investment relationship with China. Can you just bring us up to speed a little bit on what your observations have been when it comes to understanding the role of the cybersecurity law in this ongoing sort of relationship and contested relationship between the US and China?
Yeah, sure, Sam. And hi, everybody, and very happy to be here. And so I think, when I read, the reports about the Chinese cybersecurity law in Western media, I think there's a lot of, and in the discourse, there's a lot of nuance that's lost. So from our perspective, the Chinese cybersecurity law is currently, it's really initiative in trying to really protect China against some real serious problems that they face. There's a lot of perceptions that Chinese authorities take an offensive position when it comes to these developing laws and regulations, but actually it's really often about defense. And so China faces a host of really very significant problems when it comes to online criminality. I mean, all of our lives are online in China. It's incredible. And as a result, there's an incredible amount of fraud, hackers, like just general ridiculous ineptitude when it comes to online, so leading to like significant data breaches. Of course, there's concerns about foreign interference in their critical infrastructure as well. And you would think in this kind of extremely hostile online environment that there would be, a focus on securing some of these, particularly like some of these critical information these critical organizations, or even just organizations that hold an incredible amount of personal or financial data, but there's not. There is like a woeful lack of cybersecurity in China. It's getting better 3 years into the cybersecurity law, but 3 years ago, there was some, I can share some anecdotes to kind of highlight how bad the problem is. I attended a session with an auditor of China's critical information infrastructure maybe a year and a half ago, and he was auditing what anyone would define critical information infrastructure anywhere around the world. So, airlines, banks, power stations, etc. And he said that in these audits, when he was going off and he would say things like, can you please introduce me to the person who's in charge of cybersecurity at your organization? They would introduce him to someone in PR, or he would be introduced to somebody who was the security guard at the front gate where people park their cars. And so, hearing that as someone who actually lives in China and like flies airlines here, for example, and it really was alarming, actually, the extent of the problem that the Chinese authorities face in terms of making sure that there isn't even like a minutia amount of cybersecurity. So I think that's a really important point that is lost in these discussions, that China has some real risks that they need to face, that they're facing, and that the cybersecurity law is really the blueprint to close those gaps. And all of the enforcement that has been taken over the past 3 years really shows you that that's what they're trying to do. It's been focused primarily on critical information infrastructure, Chinese organizations and Chinese individuals and companies that should be protecting data that have not been protecting data or have not been protecting the critical infrastructure. There's a perception that a lot of these laws and regulations, particularly the CSL, the cybersecurity law, is focused on foreign companies, and we have not seen that. In fact, I would say 99% of the enforcement today is against Chinese organizations and firms. Where there has been foreign companies that have experienced enforcement actions in regards to the Chinese cybersecurity law, it has been quite severe. There has been very significant enforcement actions where there's been staff detained and exit bans placed on foreign staff here. But from our perspective, these companies were clearly violating some key aspects of the cybersecurity law. Not like it's not gray. It was very clear that they had crossed a huge line. And 3 years into the cybersecurity law, it should be quite apparent to some of these companies that do handle sensitive data and sensitive technologies that they have to become compliant with some of the new rules here. In fact, their Chinese counterparts have been experiencing these enforcement actions for 3 years, and they fail to see the warning signs.
Carly, I love in the conversations that we've had about this, how you always highlight in the enforcement actions, this is not just directed at foreign companies. This is Chinese companies as well, particularly for the reasons that you said. It's about sort of low levels of cybersecurity maintenance. I wanted to talk about a key phrase that has come up in a lot of these associated regulations. The secure and controllable language is this phrase that has popped up for years. And turn to Xiaomeng to talk about what does this mean? And given what Carly said, that a lot of these things are directed at domestic companies, yet we have language, this secure and controllable language, which seems very much about sort of replacing foreign vendors with local vendors that are deemed to be more secure because of geography, because they're local. Xiaomeng, can you comment on this language, and in particular recently how it's changed a bit, so we're starting to see secure and reliable? What are the implications of this in terms of the foreign investment landscape?
Yeah, definitely. So what does secure controllable mean? Basically, this means indigenous innovation promotion in the new political lens, the new geopolitical landscape. It's a very politically flavored term. Who do I trust? Some Europeans are trustworthy, some Japanese may be trustworthy. These days, Koreans are increasingly more trustworthy than other allies in these political lens. So in a way, secure controllable is the new indigenous innovation. And despite all the US Section 301 investigation pushing against China's forced IP transfer practice over the past 2 years, all the big tariff drops over the years, there's still secure, controllable movement on the ground of Beijing. Maybe on paper, you will see the edges of secure, controllable are being sent off, like the new cybersecurity review measure, the word controllability has been eliminated. And for a lot of the secure, controllable, secure, reliable technical standards, local reps on the Beijing work very heavily and took out a lot of discriminatory language out of it, but it's not going away. There is this this coalition of about, I think right now, 100, 200 Chinese companies. They call themselves the Secure Reliable Alliance, the Anchor Alliance. They have been set up in 2017, backed by, I heard, billions of government subsidies towards government procurement projects every year. And they are quietly implementing the informal 352 policy, replace foreign brands by 30% this year, 50% next year, 20% the year after. That's their goal. It's not on paper. The government official will pick up a phone and call someone. That's how they communicate this message. Originally, the founders of the alliance are 6 type of indigenous chip companies and 2 domestic operating companies. Their first goal is to replace the Wintel model. And after that, they will venture into software, CRM, cloud. That's their long-term goal. And recently, the domestic operating system called UOS launched their product, and you can see the way they price their product. For the individual users, it's about the same price as Windows 10. But for government procurement projects, the price is a third of that. How do you do that? You need billions of government procurement money to back that up, and that's what they're doing. And they took down their official website and a lot of newsletter since the beginning of the Anti-Made in China 2025 campaign, but they're still operating on full speed and not allowing any foreign participant in their meetings.
Graham, you've covered the final cybersecurity review measures that just came out that Xiaomeng mentioned, where we saw the term controllability removed. You did a great piece on this, published on DigiChina. Can you give us your views on what these measures have been long awaited since 2017 when the cybersecurity law took effect? What's your impression about what the final measures say, particularly in light of removing that controllability phrase, and also in terms of Carly's comments about what the government's sort of intentions with some of these measures are supposed to be?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. First, I want to say that we did this piece with Lauren Dudley from CFR, Roger Kramers from Leiden, and Elsa Kania from Harvard. So it was a team effort to translate and analyze these final measures. Just a little word on what they are. So the cybersecurity law comes up with a bunch of broad requirements that then need to be implemented by detailed regulations. And in this particular case, it's some of what Carly was talking about, protecting critical information infrastructure. And they list things like telecommunications, radio and television, energy, finance, road and waters, emergency management, hygiene and healthcare, national defense, tech and industry. You know, it's a very broad set of legitimately important industries and sectors for national security. What we saw over the 3 years since the cybersecurity law went into effect in June 2017 was that these rules were in kind of a draft, or it was a trial form, and then there was a new draft that did mention this concept of secure and controllable, which really does mean indigenous or domestic innovation or domestic products. And this time it's dropped secure and controllable, but it's shifted a focus to supply chain security. And the implication of this rhetorically, I think, is a bit of a convergence with Chinese and international concerns about what it means to rely on foreign suppliers, possibly from countries that are rivals of one kind or another, for domestic critical infrastructure. It's a concern, obviously, that the US government and many other governments have about Huawei infrastructure in the 5G networks. And so there's a parallelism there, but effectively, it means for domestic companies, there is this set of hurdles to go through to get certified for use in critical information infrastructure if you're selling network products and services, and these are very broad categories. For international companies, it's the same set of hurdles. It's just that the standards by which the certification will be decided are kind of yet to be seen, and it leaves room for the government in China to use this as a barrier for market entry and as a way to prop up, to create a market for these domestic companies that Xiaomeng was talking about. If you keep out the international competitors for either legitimate or slightly, trumped up security reasons, then the domestic competitors can compete. We just don't know how they're actually going to do that yet. That's what's left open. And it really does keep a lot of latitude for the Chinese government to decide that they're going to be more open or more closed, to be more security sensitive or less security sensitive, and frankly, to be more excluding or more welcoming of foreign companies over time. So I expect we're just going to see, again, now, even though everything's spelled out in a certain way, the latitude of the bureaucracy and the ability to follow the political winds really remains, I think.
I want to focus for a moment before we turn more to the view from Washington on restrictions around cross-border data flows, because when the cybersecurity law first came out, this was one of the most concerning aspects of it. Would the government begin requiring broad swaths of data to be stored locally on servers in China? What does this mean for multinational organizations? And I want to ask this question to Naomi and also to Xiaomeng. There's still been a lot of ambiguity about what kind of data has to be localized. The government has split out different kinds of data, personal data, important data. This part of the cybersecurity regime is still very much in flux. There are outstanding regulations that are in draft amid intense internal debate. What is the latest on this? Are you, in your experience with multinational companies, are you seeing this become a major market access barrier? Is this an area where the Chinese government has shown any willingness to be responsive to foreign concerns? Maybe Naomi, start with you, and then Xiaomeng to talk about some of your views as well.
Sure. So it's been pretty well established, I think, both by multinational foreign companies as well as domestic Chinese companies, that data localization is problematic for any company that wishes to be multinational in nature. Transferring data across borders is just a day-to-day necessity. So we've seen some shifts towards contemplating opening some sort of quiet conversations among the technical experts within the Chinese ministries, trying to figure out how they open the aperture a little bit on some of those regulations and how they implement them. That said, there's still a lot of ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty, even within the government, as to how to implement. I would just add that the ongoing nature of the COVID pandemic adds a different layer to all of this, in that, we're seeing very clearly in our daily lives the importance of data and data transfer and the cloud. It's enabled this conversation that we're having right now. So I think that will cause governments to recognize, not just China, but other governments that have these data localization and cloud restrictions on the books, but they have not yet implemented them. It may give them pause and cause them to reconsider exactly how would that be implemented and to what benefit in a post-COVID world.
Yeah, I would agree that perspective. I think, for one, the issue of data localization is technically very complex. It's more complex than CII scoping. It's more complex than secure controllable. And you add that to the political ramification any technical regulation standards may generate. That's why it takes a regulator a long time. For now, it's 3 years now. They haven't figured out how to finish this regulation. There are 6 drafts flying around, and they couldn't make up their mind because they understand the implication is profound, both for domestic and international stakeholders. And in the past, that's the central level government's attitude towards this. And the regional government, the municipalities, give them pressure too, because every once in a while you will see whether it's a Hainan Free Trade Zone wants to fully open up and attract tourism by providing them access to BBC and CNN and Facebook and Twitter, and they will push the envelope and jump the gun, sometimes issue their own guidance saying we're going to provide this exemption, and that got taken down by CAC because they didn't coordinate with the central government. That happened within a few days. And Hong Kong government have done similar things in the past in a more nuanced way. They try to go to Beijing and say, you want to keep Hong Kong stable, you want to integrate us with like Shenzhen and Zhuhai to create this economic triangle, and we need a little bit more data flow. We need to revitalize our economy, our financial center status in Hong Kong. We need to compete with Singapore. Why don't we thin up the Great Firewall a little bit, maybe create a tiny hole on the wall so we can allow tiny bit data flow in some kind of monitor environment. And more recently, Shanghai government issued their next 5-year plan to promote 5G deployment, IoT, emerging technology. And one element is we are having this thought of doing this pilot project to let foreign companies, maybe our own company, to have this little bit less censored access to the international internet. That's the idea. What do you think about this? That's another sign showing them, oh, we are still thinking about this. We are contemplating, we are trying to explore. What if we just open up a tiny bit? There's a tiny bit crack on the armor, but we'll watch it very closely and see how it goes, especially in this COVID-19 environment overall, from municipal, provincial, all the way to central government is trying to cuddle with foreign investors to combat the negative economic impact that COVID-19 has in China. 6.8% GDP negative growth in the first quarter. They have to find a way to get themselves out of it. So I would say for companies out there, think about this, think about even like a cloud market entry into China and lobbying for the data localization route. This could be a window of opportunity. If anything, you won't hurt yourself by bringing this up. Chinese government officials are reaching out to foreign investors. They're getting out of their way to try to help you to stay there, don't move jobs outside of China. So I see this as a spotlight. We'll see how long it lasts, but right now it seems to be a good timing to talk about this.
Interesting. And Carly, do you want to chime in on anything on that? Because I know you've worked very closely navigating what kinds of data can go, what kinds of data can stay, the ongoing definitions of what is important data. You know, we were at a conference in Zhuhai earlier this year where one of the senior scholars got up on stage and said, what is important data? We don't even know. So anything you want to chime in to add to the data flow conversation, and then we're going to shift to the Washington view.
Yeah, this is like, I would say the number one question that we get from our clients is, do they have to localize their data to China? Because they view this as potentially the most onerous and expensive compliance requirement for doing business in China. But we have walked through a lot of our clients across several sectors through what they could potentially have to localize to China. And I think a lot of companies seem to think that it's everything that they have in terms of data, but it's often just like, if there is a localization requirement, potentially, it's a very specialized subset of their data. It's data that's truly critical to China's national security. Not every company has data that could potentially infringe on China's national security. So for this type of data, then it's about finding out where this data sits. For some companies, they actually already have it sitting in China, so it's actually not a very onerous requirement. For some, it will be an onerous requirement to localize to China. But having said that, we have seen some sector regulators put in finalized data localization rules. So there is data localization that's happening in China as we speak. So in healthcare and finance, we've seen finalized data localization rules in these specific sectors. So this is moving ahead in sectors.
So oftentimes when I'm in China, in the past 2 years, I've been asked, is the US moving to localized data? And this conversation started when FIRMA overhauled the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which made a new important criteria of that review for inbound foreign investment. To what extent would this transaction potentially give a Chinese investor, a Chinese company, access to sensitive US citizen data, and this becoming a criteria to block that investment? And then most recently, there've been a number of initiatives coming from Washington to limit access to US citizen data. Senator Hawley has proposed a bill which would require data to be stored on servers here in the US, essentially stop at the physical border of the US rather than go to China. I testified at this hearing in January. You have specific Chinese companies being targeted The Chinese drone maker DJI, for example, potentially falling in the crosshairs, the Department of Interior grounding its entire fleet of drones on the basis that DJI is accessing data, despite the fact that the company went through a validation by the US government that said, actually, they don't hold any customer data. And now we don't have those drones for things like firefighting, search and rescue, a host of things. We can talk about that in a moment, but I want to shift to what's happening from Washington. And Naomi, can you just kick off the conversation for us? What are you seeing in terms of even just the latest amid everything going on with COVID? We have a suite of new export control restrictions that have come down the pike. What are your observations? What impact is this having?
Sure. So obviously in a time of international crisis, you would hope that countries would find areas to cooperate, to beat the threat posed to all of us. But unfortunately, it seems like COVID has only heightened tensions in the bilateral US-China relationship. And export controls and concern with respect to technology, both going out of the US and coming into the US, has really continued apace. And recently we've seen additional export controls rules, many of which are issued in their final form. And so they're effective within roughly 2 months of publication without the opportunity for industry comment or feedback prior to implementation, which is obviously problematic from our perspective, as there can be a lot of unintended consequences when you're focused on a specific threat and not necessarily seeing the full spectrum of risk mitigation options in play. So most recently, there's been increased concern specifically about the civil-military relationship in China. And it was interesting to see that called out as bluntly as it was in the recent export control rules that effectively expand the definition of what constitutes a military use. So if you have a tech product that is controlled, and that's the other piece of this, the Department of Commerce has added new technologies to the restrictions, which capture semiconductors, which are a huge piece of the technological puzzle, used in all major advanced technologies. So capturing that in conjunction with limiting the ability of US companies to sell products really has a significant negative impact. And those unforeseen consequences are going to be very difficult to understand without consulting with industry. What constitutes a civil or a military end user is really kind of murky and difficult to decipher. And then what's the risk if a chip is used in a personal computer, for example, that's used by a Chinese military representative? What is the risk there? And those issues need to be evaluated. So, in a sense, we're seeing these, what had previously been kind of a more academic perspective on, what is the relationship between civil and military mean? It's coming out to the forefront in these regulations. And so that's both interesting and disconcerting from our perspective.
Let's talk about for a moment some specific Chinese companies that are in the crosshairs of some of this. The last year, all we heard about was Huawei. Now there's a whole suite of new names that are coming out. And so Naomi, can you talk about what's going on with China Telecom? And then Graham, I want to go to you and talk about Zoom, which is enabling all of this to happen right now, and I think is under some interesting scrutiny. So what's going on with China Telecom? What is Team Telecom, first of all, and sort of what have they been up to? And how is this playing out? Naomi first, and then Graham, let's talk about Zoom.
Sure. So this is another regulation that's recently come to light through the issuance of a new executive order focused on this team telecom, which is essentially all of the major US national security agencies, DOJ, DHS, Defense, and it's led by DOJ, but it's FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, that is the implementer. And Team Telecom is responsible for advising FCC from a national security perspective whether or not issuing a license to operate telecoms networks in the US constitutes an undue threat. And this has been, Team Telecom has been previously established and operational for some time, but it's kind of been reinvigorated through this recent executive order and effectively given increased, I don't want to say increased power, but there's an emphasis on looking back at previously issued licenses, and that's where the China Telecom issue comes in. China Telecom had previously been granted a license to operate in the US, and right now that is under scrutiny. It's not a done deal, but Team Telecom, this group of national security agencies, has unanimously recommended to the FCC that it revoke China Telecom's license to operate in the US based on national security concerns. And I don't think, to be clear, that this is all political theater. If you read the report, which is redacted, presented by the team and in particular by a subset of the Department of Commerce, it does contain a significant track record of lack of compliance on the part of China Telecom with respect to adhering to both state and federal cybersecurity and privacy policies, and also a lack of seriousness in remediating certain issues that the FCC had previously flagged to China Telecom. So I don't think we can say that this is all, there are a lot of areas of the political climate where it's all China, all bad. I don't think that this is necessarily one. There are certainly elements of it. It's certainly coming to the fore because of the focus on China and the inherent threat posed by China and Chinese companies. And I'm not saying that that's a credible assessment, but there are certain areas where we need to take the national security concerns seriously and not look at everything through a political lens, but through an evidence-based process. And I'm glad to see that the Department of Commerce released that report publicly, even though it is redacted, because I think it's important that all of these assertions are backed up by fact at where they can be, and that's more true in some cases than others.
I completely agree with that, right? And there's, whether you're talking about this concept of small yard, high fence, the idea that you're more selective about what you restrict, but aggressive in restricting it, or, openness with guardrails. Are we putting the right guardrails in place? Are we connecting and disconnecting in the right way, but ultimately keeping an open system? And I think when we can identify in a fact-based, non-ideological way where there are legitimate threats, and also where the national security community is transparent about what those threats are, that's an important conversation to have. Graham, what's your read on the Zoom conversation? Can you just get us up to speed on why has Zoom fallen under scrutiny? What do you think is valid? What's not valid? How do you, as all these different companies are coming to the crosshairs, how do you look at the Zoom situation?
Well,
and again, Zoom's not a Chinese company, so why is this even part of the conversation?
Right. So I think there's two things that have brought Zoom into the cybersecurity conversation, in addition to the fact that we're all using it constantly. People in jobs like ours are doing this all the time. So the two main things are, there was an incident reported where some of Zoom's data was being routed through Chinese based servers at some point, and they say they corrected that. The second, possibly deeper suspicion comes from the fact that Zoom operates a large number, or there are a large number of Chinese-based engineering employees working for Zoom through various subsidiaries. And we were talking about this earlier, and I looked at some approximate numbers. There was a report from the Toronto-based Citizen Lab noting that at least 700 employees in China work in research and development, and rough statistics suggested that there's about 1,000 employees working in engineering for Zoom, meaning that a good majority of them are probably based in China. So if you're thinking in the way that people think about Huawei, which is to say that having research and development and engineering done in China gives the Chinese government the ability to, perhaps, try to get a back door or get the ability to sort of spy on people or sabotage systems. Yeah, that you could imagine that that's a possibility. I think the bigger question is really, how secure do we expect to be in these times? And I had already been personally skeptical of Zoom because last year they were found to have an undocumented, I think it was a web server that they were running on Mac computers. And it was really it was just a cybersecurity disaster. I mean, it was something that could be exploited by others. It suggested the company didn't have very strong security practices. This isn't about a China threat. Anybody could have exploited this thing. And so from my perspective, the bigger question is, what level of security do we demand from these types of systems? And that's a much broader question. It's not really about, the Chinese government putting their thumb on some engineers to try to get a backdoor in. It's about large organizations with people using their personal laptops at home on unsecured networks. How many people have been perfect in their link clicking hygiene forever with their personal laptop? It's very hard to secure IT stuff if you don't have some centralized efforts and control. So, from my perspective, the security question is broader, and the Zoom controversy is there because it parallels other things, the Huawei questions about data flows. And to me, that wouldn't be the biggest threat. I wouldn't think that the Chinese government could only get into various conversations by tapping into Zoom when all of our laptops are probably, less tidy than they should be.
I think what worries me about the Zoom conversation is the fact that this is now becoming conflated. The idea that you have a Chinese CEO for a US-based company, but also I want to know how many, if we look at the US companies that have engineering teams in China doing R&D on products that are used globally, how unique is that to Zoom? I mean, I want to know, comparatively, what data is there about, say, what companies like Apple and Microsoft and, Google, which we all think isn't even in China, they actually are in China. And they have research and development teams that are working on a host of products, developing apps for Android or ad tech and the like. Is Zoom actually unique? I would guess, and I don't have the data on this, but I would like to see data on for globally operating US tech firms. There's a compelling reason to have engineers, in China. There's talent, there's workforce issues. And I worry about Zoom getting caught up in this sort of, xenophobic moment because they have a sort of Chinese head of the company. And I would sort of push on, can we look at this in a more objective fashion, given that all communication apps and services, regardless of nationality, should probably come under more scrutiny for privacy and security. But to make this part of a China bashing problem, to me, is sort of problematic. Xiaomeng, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. Actually, I want to add to it. I think it has the unintended consequence on American company as well. There are a lot of companies facing the tightening scrutiny of CFIUS and export control. Some of my clients looking at this downward slope, right? For export control, they thought the ministry was a game, and now they think foreign direct product rule is the next tranche, but the military use language came before that, to the extent that you are talking about building a small yard with high fence. They're building a football field with the wall that US is building again at the Mexico border. It definitely shoots American companies in their own foot, to the extent some of my clients are thinking the way the export control CFIUS rule goes down this route, they are thinking about delinking their technology from the US nationality to escape these rules. So that means moving some of their R&D, their employees overseas, or even headquarters. Why don't you move from California to Ireland to escape all this? When you are thinking about 80% of your clients are Chinese companies, and Chinese economy will become the largest in the world in the next 5 to 10 years. That's a market you can't give up. So they will delink themselves from this territory in order to escape. And the Chinese market, the Chinese regulatory regime is bad, but the US is worse. So you pick the lesser evil. That's the choice they have to make.
I want to use the last 10 minutes of our conversation before we open up to Q&A from the audience to bring this back a bit to the digital response to the pandemic. And this is an area where I think, shortly after the virus broke out in China, the Chinese government used the very same digital surveillance tools which were used to censor and control information about the infections in the first place. Those tools were then very quickly turned to clamp down and stop the spread of the virus in the form of these elaborate, if messy, contact tracing apps through the government's health code program deployed on Alibaba and Tencent platforms. Would love to hear, I guess first, can we start with Carly, because you left China, were away with your family when this was going down, recently came back and have been sort of living firsthand through the very gradual reopening of the economy in China, aided in many ways by some of these digital tools. Can you just give us a flavor of what that experience has been like? How have digital technologies been used? And then we'll talk about some of the policy implications of it.
Yeah, sure, Sam. And first of all, I would say that I've probably used this app maybe, or been asked to display the app maybe 3 times in the past 5 weeks. So it's not actually used very extensively since I've been back in Shanghai in about mid-March. So just kind of to level set, I think, and I really tried to peel back what this app is in Shanghai, and I can only speak for Shanghai because there's a lot of indicators that every province probably has a different system and a different way of ranking people in terms of health risk. But basically in Shanghai, there's a mini app embedded on Alipay and WeChat, a government app that's embedded on these 2 platforms that is doing 2 things. It's pulling data from a centralized database, from a centralized government database. This data in Shanghai is telling us, where have we been in the past 14 days? Have we been in a high risk or key country that would give us a red code? Okay, so have we been somewhere that has a lot of COVID, basically? That would give us a red code. If we haven't, that's the green code. Or have you been under medical quarantine? Basically, those are the 2 questions that the Shanghai app is asking, pulling from the centralized government database, and that's how you get your code. It's actually quite simple. So that's the first function. The second function, and this is something that the New York Times reported on, is that the app itself is actually reporting back where we are, our geolocation, to the police, which is not that surprising, actually. So that's the contact tracing element of it that I actually haven't seen or heard how that's actually been applied in Shanghai, to be honest. So I think to the question here, I think a lot of people are concerned, like what has this app done to change, or how does it change the status quo here in China in terms of privacy and surveillance? And I don't think a lot. I mean, surveillance is a fact of life in China. Surveillance by the police is a fact of life in China, and I don't think this app has changed that fundamental reality of China. In terms of privacy, the cybersecurity law is about enabling the state, basically, control over our information, and this hasn't changed that status quo as well. Coupled with the fact that it's not really asked for as much, and you can delete it off your phone. I'm not seeing that this is a fundamental game changer for how things are done in China.
Graham, you and the DigiChina team did a translation and some commentary on the CAC shortly after the pandemic began, I think released some guidelines about how to protect personal information while using digital tools to combat the spread. Can you share with us from a policy perspective, how do you think the Chinese government responded to that issue? What was effective? Where do you think there were sort of loopholes that are worrisome to you?
Well, so there were a couple of documents that we translated fairly early on in the development of these apps. It was before these color-coded apps came out, and then there was one that came out right around the same time that the color codes emerged. And basically, it was a declaratory policy. It was guidance that said, hey, all you big data people, let's try to work on epidemic response together. You know, you need to mobilize, everybody should mobilize to try to make this better for everybody. But remember, if you're switching what type of business that you're doing to start dealing with sensitive personal information like health status, you have all of these obligations. And so it just sort of reiterated a number of things that are already there in the regulations for companies that operate in China with personal information. And those are things like consent, notice and consent. You know, the user is supposed to be, you know, have a choice at least about whether, you know, what data is collected and how it's used. It's about minimization of which data are collected. It's stuff that's very familiar to anyone who's studied the European General Data Protection Regulation. But as you know, Sam and I have spent a lot of time on this sort of data protection scheme, and it does have huge exceptions for government surveillance and police activities. So when national security or public safety are on the line, and when the government is the one doing the data collection and management, you know, these regulations don't really touch that. So it was basically a restatement of status quo. I don't know yet how these things have been handled. I would suspect, as Carly said, there are reports that there's different apps in different localities across the whole country. I bet some of them are breaking a lot of the rules. And I bet some of them are probably being pretty careful with the rules, such as they are. And the question to me is sort of going forward, does this or does it not reflect an advance of the you know, state and private sector alignment in conducting domestic surveillance? It did seem like a step forward in that respect, to really have collaboration where in the case that was reported in Hangzhou, it was the Alibaba affiliate and financial, I think, was behind building their color code app. You know, and that just put the police and Alibaba's financial partner in direct collaboration when it comes to contact tracing and social network graphing and all of that type of thing. That could be a tide that ebbs backward, but it did mark something that had been imagined in some of people's sort of worst nightmares about, you know, digital authoritarianism, but we actually hadn't seen that level of integration in many cases yet. So I'm just looking to the future to see whether these things morph into ongoing, you know, public-private partnerships on surveillance, or whether there really is. I mean, as Carly said, it sounds like the app in Shanghai may not be all that relevant for too long. And certainly it was already the case that authorities, if they were trying to look for a particular person, could get that person's location from their wireless company or from other apps that track them. So, you know, I think it's a question looking forward whether it actually gets darker. I will just say in general that, you know, watching China's freedom of expression and surveillance environment over the last dozen years or so, you know, 8 or 12 years ago, there was a pattern where sometimes things would get tighter and sometimes things would relax. For the last 7 or 8 years, it just gets tighter and tighter, and we haven't seen a lot of ratcheting back. And that's just a broader question of the human rights situation and the type of authoritarianism that the party and Xi Jinping's government have been pursuing recently. And we just don't know. I mean, they may have that this is a big period of change for China on a macro level, and we'll be watching.
One of the questions that I've had is, if we think about, Graham, to your point about the relationship between the government and the tech platforms when it comes to data access, this is one where in the background, quietly, we've had a lot of there's been a lot of pushback from Chinese tech companies to government access, the government data access requests. And one of the questions that I've had is, how does the pandemic impact that, particularly in light of this greater collaboration in the development of some of these apps? Will that, will some of that pushback from the tech platforms, is that going to fade? Are we going to see a sort of more co-governance when it comes to data, or is this something that after the after the wave is over, we'll go back to the tug of war when it comes over data, even if quietly, even under the radar, even if in an environment of increasing government control over the online space. So it's something that I'm watching. We have 4 minutes left. I want to quickly get some of the questions. I apologize for those of you who submitted questions if we don't get to all of your answers. I'm going to start with one from Milton Mueller. Xiaomeng mentioned that several domestic initiatives to relax controls on internet information, such as Hong Kong, Shanghai, Hainan. Are those initiatives threatened by the growing hostility between the US and China? Xiaomeng, do you want to lead us off on that?
Sorry, you froze a little bit. So are those local initiatives being impacted by the US-China relations?
Right. Are these initiatives threatened by the growing hostility between the US and China? And particularly because it sounded like from some of your read on them, this might be an area of space, of maneuverability with more of a desire for foreign investment. How does the hostility between the two governments at the highest levels impact that space for maneuver there?
Yeah, definitely. The worsening relationship definitely narrowing the space the local government can have to maneuver in this area. So in the past, the US-China bilateral relationship on the trade side is mostly managed by JCCT and a little bit SNED. So US government can indirectly push on the issue on behalf of US industry interest. And now there are those US companies political position is definitely undermined by the overall political environment. When company like AWS or IBM or Oracle go to the Hong Kong government, discuss this issue with them, and actually some of them help the Hong Kong government to bring their proposal to Beijing. They are part of the initiative. They have very little leverage in Beijing because the bilateral US-China relations. And also in other localities, I think there was a case in the past, Facebook made a registration in one of the localities, and there was a discussion what's going to happen next. And that initiative got killed in 2 minutes. I think that's also heavily impacted by the bilateral relationship. If we can make a little bit maneuver in the higher level bilateral relationship, that will definitely have a huge impact. It will come up with a clean and elegant solution on data localization and other issues, and help with the municipalities' initiative tremendously.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank all of the panelists. For those of you who submitted questions that we couldn't answer, I encourage you to reach out to us and continue the conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and everyone stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, everybody.